Hello, Year 12 students. So we are beginning now with part 4 of Ransom by David Malouf. We're going to go from page 167 through to 176, which is the beginning of part 4. And it shifts to the narrative perspective. We've been with Priam and Somax for the last part 2 and part 3, and now we're back to mirroring part 1, we're back to the narrative perspective of Achilles. And remember, when we left Achilles at the end of part 1, he was struggling with that grief. There was the description of it being like the clogging grey web that enfolded him, and he's raging day after day, as he has for 11 days, dragging that body behind him. And there's that description right at the end of the chapter where he's waiting for something to appear that would break that spell on him, something new and unimaginable, which is quite literally what Priam has endeavoured to embark upon too. So those parts are going to come together in this section. So Priam is at the mess, which is dinner. If anybody you know your military terms, that's called the mess. And so there's a description of the men, his myrmidons, who are shoulder to shoulder eating. He has his attendants, Automedon and Alcimus, who are both there. And over on the next page, 168, there's the description of Automedon, who is now the chief attendant, the driver of his chariot, so his closest body servant. So now that Patroclus is gone, Automedon has taken his place, and he's described as one of the noblest of the Myrmidons. There's a description of him here. And Achilles, though, is not easy with him. He resents Automedon because his presence is a reminder and a rebuke. So when Patroclus died, it was Automedon who ran and lifted him up and held him close in his arms. It was Automedon who stood behind the body and was blinded by tears as they fought the Trojan jackals off him and not me, Achilles tells himself, in his arms, not mine. So the focus of the resentment that Achilles holds towards Automedon is to do with the fact that Automedon was there when Patroclus died. And because he resents them, Achilles made him his squire because Patroclus would expect it of him, but it rankles. Okay, that it hurts him. And Automedon is aware of this. He's also grieving. He loves Achilles, and not just for Patroclus' sake, but he doesn't let his hurt interfere with his job. And now there's a description, we're on 170. There's a description of the young men eating, and Achilles has to force himself to take something from these dishes. Now, there's an idea that they can only eat, like the Myrmidons can only eat when Achilles does. So Automedon tries to not make it obvious that they've been holding back from eating, but Alcimus, who is just a boy, doesn't. And once Achilles has served himself, the boy, who is probably a youth, but quite large, he stuffs himself basically. So Achilles is fond of Alcimus. He feels sorry for him. He finds it endearing, this hulking awkwardness, the idea that he's a youth but he's large, gangling. And so Achilles keeps eating so that his companions can eat. So even in the midst of his grief, he is still able to reach out and think of his men. And now, at the bottom of 171, there is the silvery notes that appear, and a god moves invisible among them. So Achilles is aware of the presence of the god, which is interesting because so was Priam earlier. And so there's a mirroring there too. So there's the silvery notes of the lyre touch and change the air. And so the notes I've written at the 172 here says that everything sort of stops and becomes dreamlike. There's this sudden suspension of the hard manly qualities, and it's a melting of will and of self. There's a fluidity, and Achilles says that he's moved into his mother's element, open to her shimmering influence. He sees things, a thickening of that half light, and he sees a figure. As yet, all hovering vagueness has begun to take shape. So notice the poetic descriptions of the mother's element, the fluidity that's used there with the presence of the divinity, the presence of gods. And he believes that the figure that has taken shape near him is Patroclus. You, at last, he watches, but it's not actually a young man. And so he's sorrowful there. And then the figure, as it becomes clearer, he is not a young man, but he is old, wearing a white robe without decoration. And he believes it's his father. So he rises from his seat. And I was trying to work out when I read this first time, can they see it? Can the others see it or not? But I think at this point, with the action of Achilles standing up, his two companions, Alcimus and Automedon, actually notice what's there. So Achilles says it's 9 years since Achilles saw his father, since they sailed from Phthia, when he was just a boy, fully grown, but not the man that he has become due to the 9 years of war. And so he has this wave of sadness, how much his father has changed. The Peleus he left, who clasped him strongly to his breast, reluctant to the point of tears to let him go. So Peleus had been in the prime of his life. Father, he says, and overcome with tenderness for this old man and this trembling frailty. Peleus, father. So there's an intense wave of emotion that Achilles feels when he believes this man who has been visited through the influence of the gods, he believes that it is his father, and he has these memories, and he falls onto one knee and clasps his father's robe. Now Automedon and Alcimus have their swords drawn and they're at his side. And then Achilles is startled and he looks again, and it's actually not his father. It's a stranger. He's noble, even in his plain robe, but he's not at all like Peleus. What tricks the heart can play. So maybe he yearned for it to be his father. He hoped for it to be his father. You could debate, and it's probably worth having a debate, of whether there was some divine influence in this vision of his father first, or whether it was Achilles manufacturing it out of his own desire, the heart play perhaps. But anyway, so he says, or he narrates to himself, that 100 beats of his heart, his father had been truly present to him. And he continues now to feel tenderly vulnerable to all those emotions in him that belong to that sacred bond. And I think that is a key point there. So because of the initial thought, feeling that it was his father, he now is tenderly vulnerable to those emotions that have been churned up, and he is willing to converse with this new man. And so, who are you? How did you get into the hut? There was something uncanny about this stranger appearing so suddenly and unnoticed. So they know that there has been something of the gods involved in the appearance. And the man we know as Priam, but when it's being narrated from Achilles' perspective, he doesn't know that. He looks as if he might fall. He glances apprehensively at those two young men, and Alcimus is lion-like, who is ready to pounce and defend Achilles. And Achilles tells them to put away their swords. Now we come back a little bit for a short point to the narrative perspective of Priam. Priam steadies himself. He has come to kneel to Achilles, but instead the great Achilles is kneeling to him. So it's happened, and it's happened quickly in the way that he's not prepared for. And he announces himself in his identity. I am Priam, king of Troy. I've come to see you, Achilles, just as you see me, just as I am. Good quote for you to learn there. To ask you, man to man, as a father, for the body of my son, to ransom and to bring home. All right. So Priam prepares for them to strike him down, and they continue to stand alert. Automedon has his hand on his sword, but Achilles doesn't act. How did you get here? Into the camp and into the hut. I was guided, Priam answers. And he thinks of the god Hermes, the giant killer, and he takes heart. It gives him a little bit of confidence. Achilles is impressed by this, and he doesn't repeat the word, but he understands that more than ordinary forces have brought him here, that there was the god's approval on his visiting here. And Priam explains that he came in a wagon with his herald, and the bottom of 76 here, he does not kneel. The occasion for that has passed. So the whole scene that he imagined and acted out in his mind doesn't take place. Instead, he stands quietly in the stillness that surrounds them, despite the noise that Achilles' myrmidons are making, and wait. And so we're going to stop there. The next section of this is probably where I've taken the most notes in the whole novel. So, I think that's too long for us to go into. So we're going to pause and do that in the next video.